Witches and Wise Folk of Wales and the Borders.
Hello.
Great.
There we go.
Got it on?
I got it on. There we go.
Great. Before we start, as we start, could you tell us a bit about where the name for the book comes from? Got Davis Sullivan, magician from Radnorshire, his request after his death.
Yes. So, as I was coming up with the title for this book, I was living in North America, and of course the only reference point to Wales in North America is Welsh dragon, right? Ydrych goch. So I wanted something a little different. I wanted something that was going to be symbolic of the Dyn Hospice and the magicians. So the dove and the raven is a very long standing motif. You find it in many different Welsh magicians. And there's a story of this Welsh magician coming to the end of his life. He's gained fame and power from the devil. And at the very end of his life, he knows the devil's going to come and get him. And so he says to his family, there's a whole process here, and it's all in the book, but there's a whole process. He says, there's a way to cheat death, but you'll only know if I succeed if you throw my lungs or my offal, or there's various different versions depending on the magician. Throw my offal onto a dung heap, and if you see a dove or a raven come and peck at it, then you'll know if I've gone to heaven or if I've gone to hell, right? And so if the dove comes, it means that he's gone to heaven. If the raven comes, it means he's gone to hell. And sometimes you'll have the dove and the raven fighting in front of him. So it's when I really fought to have this as the title of the book, because the first edition was going to actually be called Saints and Sinners, which would have been a very different feel. I don't think people would have known it was about magicians then, right? So, yes.
He was also buried under the wall of Llanfair Church as part of his plan with the devil.
This is the thing, yes. So anybody who has been up in the north, you tend to find this story a lot in Powys and up in Denbighshire and Wrexham and Gwynedd in that area. You tend to find that there are churches that have burials in the wall. And the story there is that in order to cheat the devil, he says, so the devil comes to him, which magician it is, and says, I will have your soul if you are buried outside or inside a church, if your body is taken out of the bed and through the front door, and various other things like that. So he says to his family, I beg of you, take my body over the base of the bed, take it out a hole in the wall, and then when you get to the church, bury me in the wall, because then it's neither inside nor outside, and then that way he cheats the devil, that little loophole right there. And of course the reality, there is a historic reality to this, is that you often find that churches and chapels and whatnot were just extended, and so it was easier for Masons to just include the burial inside the church, inside the new church wall. But you have all of these burials all over the place. And so, of course, people traveling and seeing would assume, oh, well, that must have been a magician, right, who was trying to cheat the devil.
There seems to be a lot of devil references in the north of Wales. I think there's even one of you in a taxi when you were a child.
Yeah, so that one's an interesting one. So I'm originally from up north. I'm originally from Cerwys, and I lived in Canada for 30 years. But I remember vividly as a small child going to a school in Llandurnog, and we had to go through a place called Tremyrchion, which is kind of just south of Cerwys, up in that area there. And the woman who I would travel with, it was a special ed school that I went to, would point out places in the landscape to tell me stories. And there was always this story of a wizard who lived in this tower, and the tower was ruined, and that was all I really heard about it until I figured out and looked into the stories that it was connected to one of the magicians, and kind of fit in. But yeah, the devil came to him at night and said, I'm taking you to hell, and destroyed his tower, very much like the stories of Friar Bacon or Michael Scottus or any of the big major magicians in our magical lore, right? Yeah.
Cool. And sort of more generally, how do you see the connection between place and story with reference to like landscape, community, and things like that.
Yeah, so this is really my wheelhouse. So I'm also a therapist, a psychotherapist in my regular life, also a spiritual practitioner. When you look at folklore, there is a very poignant connection between place, story, and face. And this is particularly true in the old world, but you can see this in the new world as well, right? This is why place names are so important in the original languages, because they will retain stories long after the actual story has disappeared, right? So like a local one for here is Cwmbran, right? So Valley of the Crows. Well, we know that there is some association with that valley and crows, even if we don't remember it now, right? You look in Eryri, right, Snowdonia. A lot of the lore of that place is connected in with the names and the original Cymraeg names, right? What can often happen, we see this in England particularly, is you've got place names that are both the original kind of Brittonic stories, but also then the Saxon stories. And the stories often correlate, right? So it really is very poignant that. But there's also a psychological reason too, right? A memorable story is memorable when we have a face that we can ascribe it to, a really gritty, like, ridiculous story, and then a place that you can actually go to. So you're not just wandering around in mythic landscapes, you're actually in the landscape that you are, right? The witch of the story of one of these stories becomes more real to us when we can actually go and we can see the ruins of her cottage, right? Or, you know, the burial in the church walls, right? And I think this is why North Americans particularly love coming over here, because they can actually, you know, follow the stories of King Arthur as they're wandering about, or whoever it happens to be. Go up to Sherwood Forest, even though it doesn't exist anymore. You expect it to be there because the story tells us it's there. So it changes that dynamic, you know.
So has there been a big sort of resurgence of interest in Welsh folk stories in North America?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, one thing, it's kind of a bizarre thing to be sitting here talking to you all now, knowing that 6 months ago I was in North America, in the middle of Canada. And the diaspora over there, we have such a huge Welsh diaspora. So we have first generation, we also have third, fourth, fifth generation. There are places in Ontario that like Carmarthen and, you know, Beaumaris and Cardiff. We've got a very tiny place called Cardiff. It's not as huge as over here, but it's got a general store, which is good.
You're saying that in a Canadian accent.
And I say that in a, yeah, it's just switches, right? It just switches. So there's a real need and want for authentic lore in the diaspora because the stories that they have are Americanized versions, right? And I talk about that in the book. One of the figures, I list the original Welsh source and that story, but then the American sources and how it changes. So what you have, like a magician that had no connection with eagles, for example, in the American version 2 times on, 50 years later, is suddenly eating eagle because that's giving him power. No authentic lore in that. But if that was what they had access to. So there's a real want for roots, there's a real want for connection. The Welsh language is growing in North America because we have vibrant communities of wanting to connect. And that's true for most diasporic communities. Most European people of descent want to connect in. And so there's a real vibrancy around that.
So how is the folklore of Wales different to, say, England or Scotland or Ireland or even Europe? What makes it unique?
I think this is what's been really eye-opening for me with this, is you have elements that have obviously come from English folklore because of, you know, the English incursion into Wales. But you also have those elements being radically changed, right? So you have, for example, John a Kent, very, very well-known, probably very well-known figure generally in Hereford. And when you look at his stories, they are then transposed onto figures in all over the place, in Powys, in Gwynedd, in even down in Pembrokeshire, right? But it changes to the landscape, it changes to to become a uniquely Welsh thing. And so the Welsh magician that I talk so much about, even as recent as like 1850s, there were people in academia and scholars who were really recognizing that there was a corpus of very particular Welsh stories that appeared in all of these different magicians that didn't appear in English lore. If they did, it was because maybe a small segment of that story appeared. You can really get a sense of at least I got a sense of the regionality of it. So even though if the same story is told, in the valleys, for example, and it reappears again up in Gwynedd, you really get a sense that the humor comes out. Whereas and this is true for English as well. When you really go through, you learn the cultural piece that comes out, right? The sense of humor that comes out. The north of England is a prime example of that. You get a really gritty northern sense of humor in their folklore that you wouldn't find in southern England, right? So recognizing, looking at these stories, I really recognized all the people that I grew up with, all the people that came to my parents' pub and told me stories as a kid. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. I was following on from that, I was wondering about the interconnection between the oral tradition, the written tradition, and how that works into the book, how they sort of influenced each other.
Yeah, this is so I designed the book, for those who haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I designed the book to follow the story through the written tradition. So it isn't good enough to just take a story and look at it singularly. You need to see how it has changed and grown through that written tradition. But what's also happening here is we're relying on the written tradition in order to understand the stories and learn the stories. And that, depending upon what version you're looking at, you're going to have different ideas, right? And that is actually true of the oral tradition. The oral tradition changes and mutates very rapidly on the retelling. We're just relying on dead versions in order to recreate a new version, right? And so you can trace the change of the stories based on who the folklorists and the antiquarians were speaking to. And what was really cool is Reverend Elias Owen, he spoke to a gentleman in, I think, Malwith, who told a story of a particular witch. And you have to forgive me, they all are blurring in together here. But there was another folklorist who was writing in the medium of Welsh, who spoke to the same gentleman, but 20 years later. And so the story was very, very, very similar. And the two writers they were not using the same source. So you could tell that even in the written tradition, there was a continuity there, and the story had shifted ever so slightly because the older gentleman had changed himself, right? So you get that complex interplay between the oral tradition and then the written tradition. And originally, these would have been stories that you would have only heard. Folklorists write stories down not for the people in the communities, it's for the outsiders, right? So people would have been sat around pubs, people would have been sat in kitchens, around kitchen tables, out in the fields, and they would have been telling stories to each other as they were encountering the stories in the landscape. Oh, over there, that's where, I don't know, Nerys, fell down because she was bewitched, right? Whatever it is. But then when a folklorist comes in, even if they're Welsh and from another part of Wales, they would have written that down in order to then read or give that to outsiders. So it's a parallel play, yeah. And so, a lot of these stories I didn't even know myself. I'm relying on these written records. But then, I have heard that story because I was told it when I was a kid, right?
So how do you go about researching the book? What are your sources? Who do you use? I think you've got Trevelyan, and they've got a bit of a question over that. Yes.
So I don't think I could have written this book in Canada if this had been 10 years ago. I was really relying on our online sources. I was relying on friends in Wales here who had access to Aberystwyth and the Folk Museum and other places. But archive.org was perfect for this because it has so many of our written sources on there. And so it was just a process of literally going through from the earliest all the way through to see how the story had changed. Now, some stories only have one version, and that's it. That's the entirety. If that story hadn't been written down in that way, that's it. But it was a big process. It was a big process to go through and look at, again, how it was changing through. And I wouldn't have been able to write this 10 years ago. It was an interesting process because, again, with folklorists, whenever a story is told, you always have the bias of the teller, right? So we have, in Wales particularly, and I think we should be blessed by this, we have a lot of reverends who absolutely hated these old superstitions. So what did they do? These were nonconformists and Methodists. And so what did they do? They wrote these stories down in explicit detail so that you would know that it's evil and you shouldn't be doing this, right? Of course, what we have then is a complete story. We just have to tweeze out their bias, right? Others you have, like the Reverend Elias Owen, who is amazing. Reverend Elias Owen, he was an Oxford Don, I believe he was, but he was also a Reverend. And whenever he went around visiting his fellow Reverends in North Wales, he would just ask them about the local folklore. And it came from a nationalistic place, right? He was part of the Cumridorian Society. And so this learned society was there in order to collect our culture in the face of destruction. And so he's coming from that very academic point of view. And then you have Mary Trevelyan, who I absolutely love. That's a nom de plume. She was in Cardiff. She was a travel writer. So she was interested in telling a good story. And of course, I found her out several times. If I had only been focused on Wales and not been doing parallel books on England and Scotland as well, I wouldn't have found all of the things she plagiarized. So there's a book, it's like I'm sat there, 150 years later, I'm like, what are you doing, right? But she literally plagiarized a story of a witch from a table book in North Yorkshire, and like 50 years before she was writing, and set it in Southern Down, just outside of Cardiff. But it's a good story, and it's now implanted into the landscape, so you can believe that this witch lives in that area, and I love it. Yeah.
I thought we could go through some of the stories that sort of stood out to me in the book, and you could sort of tell us a bit about them.
Of course.
So one of the first ones was finding lost goods,
yes.
Such as money, wedding rings, livestock. There's quite a lot of stories like that.
Yeah, this is. Is there anybody from Carmarthen here? Carmarthenshire? No, we've got home crowd. Okay. So has anybody heard of Dr. Harris of Cadnaf? Oh, well, you're going to learn. You're going to learn. So the book here is not just folklore about legends. It is also anecdotes about historical Welsh magical practices. And historically, this is part of my historical work, historically we did have a whole set of professionals called the Dyn Hospice. And the Dyn Hospice were very similar to the cunning folk or the pellers. And these were people that they may have had been lay preachers, but most of the time they were landed farmers. They were very interested in astrology. So in the 1700s and 1800s, these are the people that if you had a lost cow, or if you had lost something, and theft in Wales was more important than witchcraft, right? We only have 5 witch trials in all of Welsh history, right? Because the concept of witchcraft was different here than England. And what really mattered up in the valleys and up in the small isolated communities was theft. If you had a thief in your community stealing, that was going to destroy morale, right? So the whole point of these Dyn Hospice was you would go to them almost like you would tarot readers now, very, very similar kind of niche. And you would say, Mr. Savage, where I lost linen, let's say, or my cow has disappeared, or whatever it happened to be. If it wasn't a witch that did it, he would be able to look into his looking glass. So a lot of mirrors are used in this tradition, and he would say, yes, if you go, the next person you see will be the culprit, or your cow will appear and he's stood next to this brook somewhere, right? And so the stories tell us that oftentimes they would be found, but there was also this sense of they were getting paid to do this too. So the more stories told about them leading to lost goods being found, the better it was for business, because who wants to argue against the stories that are floating around the community, right? And oftentimes what would happen is if the culprit knew that so-and-so was going to the local Dyn hospice, by that virtue alone, something would reappear. Oh, I don't want to be cursed. Oh, I don't want to, So we have a real tradition of that. And so a lot of the males talked about in this book are these Dyn hospice, are these cunning folk, wise folk. And like some of the stories are absolutely ridiculous. But you see the corpus, the same stock stories flowing and following, both in North and South. So you really get that identity of Welsh magicians in this way. Yeah.
And I also enjoyed the punishment by dancing and singing.
Oh, yes.
Swansea
Yes.
Butcher.
Yeah, so this is one of Mary Trevelyan's, and it was ascribed to Dr. Harris. And Dr. Harris was a real person. He lived until 1825, and then his sons took over, and even into the 1860s, they were still practicing. But this is one we know she probably took from legends, because you see this mostly connected with like the legendary magician type. So the basic story is the magician, the Dyn hospice, the cunning man, is going through the town, and he stops at an inn. And he says, I'll have a pint of ale and a pie, or whatever it is. And the inn overcharges him. And he gladly pays, but he takes a slip of paper and he writes something on it, and he puts it under the table, so that when the barmaid or the bar owner comes over and collects the plates, suddenly they start to go a little nuts, and they start clapping and hooping and dancing and chanting, and suddenly the whole inn is suddenly joining them, and it's all a mad thing. And so somebody manages to break free, runs to the Dyn hospice, apologizes, gives him back his money, and suddenly it's all done. Everybody returns to normal. But you find it all over the place, and it's a wonderful motif. It is so much fun. Yeah.
And I've got predicting the future.
Yes. So again, these Dyn hospice, and this is again. I mean, these are folkloric versions of real life, right? And do I have any pagans in the audience? Neo-pagans? No. Okay. That's Saturday, that's right. So you have this sense then, like, the Dyn hospice were as common as, tarot readers on the street, right? You go to tarot readers to find out fortunes. Up in Denbighshire, one of my favourites, and the figure that I dedicated this book to was Arabella of Denby. She was a woman who, with her playing cards, people would go to in the markets in 1800s. Very early 1800s, and she would do her people's fortunes. So you have this gendered idea of divination through cards, divination by looking glasses. Astrology was really big, and that's a historical practice going through. But then the folklorists get hold of it, and the general public get hold of it, and they love to make these stories really sensational. So it wasn't just going and finding about love; it was going and finding about one of the stories is trying to figure out who stole a beloved person from them, and it just so happens to turn out that it's the arch enemy of the person who's going to see. And big drama. You'll get a lot of drama in this book. Like if anybody watches Publicum, this is the original Publicum, right?
And they've got fairies in Wales and fairy rings. There's a story of a young shepherd that disappears. There's quite a few stories on fairies.
Yeah, so this is why we know these stories are old, and these stories are connected in with the whole kind of, and I hate the term, but the whole kind of Celtic ideas, right? Because a lot of the stories of fairies in this mirror what you find in Ireland and in Scotland. Traditionally, the fairies were connected in with Welsh magic, so actual Welsh occult practices, but you also have this sense of the fairies being kind of the other, right? So we're used to stories of fairies stealing children. A lot of the witches talked about in this are in league with them. So you get a lot of times where witches will be stealing Bendyffryn Mamau down in the south here, the Mother's Blessing, of course, Tylwyth Teg up in the north and Cardiganshire. And you get these, it's a weird connection, because you've got, on the one hand, these witches who are stealing children for the fairies, and then you've also got these occultists and these Dunhuspists who are actively working and propitiating with the fairies. And then also, saving people. So the idea of fairy rings, people wandering into fairy rings and being lured away into fairyland. And then a year later, after going and speaking to a wise man, they'll be able to be plucked out by their loved ones. And of course, for them, only 5 minutes or 2 minutes has passed, right? Yeah.
And there's references to, which you see a lot across Wales, sort of stones, standing stones at crossroads. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so again, this is why we know that these stories are connected to the landscape, because you can go to these places, right? One of my absolute favourites is just north of Llanberis, up in Arwyddifer, or Wiffa, close to there. You've got a Cromlech stone, and there's supposed to be a cannibal, or originally was a cannibal witch, Canrig Butte, underneath. And she came to an untimely end because a local hero went and chopped her head off. And now you can actually go to that place. It's in a passage just outside of town. You can go walk to it. It's just near the stream, near the river, and that is known as Canrig Butte's stone, right? And people can go. It's a tourist destination, and it's one of those. It makes it more memorable when there's a story connected to it. Any boulder can be a boulder. But if there's a witch that's supposed to have lived underneath it, that's the witch's stone, right? Yeah.
I thought the stories of Black Robin were a lot of fun, especially his relationship with his brothers and what went on there.
Yeah, so has anybody heard of Robin Askew, Black Robin? No? So a lot of these stories are found in the north. A lot of them are in Gwynedd and going over to Mold there. And he is like the typical archetypal trickster. And a lot of the stories are kind of contained within more Welsh-speaking communities. Friends of mine down here remember vividly doing Robin stories, and they're just ridiculous stories. Robin. One day, one of my favorite stories is he said he would kill anybody who told him that his mother had died, because he loved his mum so much. So one day, his own brother had to tell him that. And there was some trick that his brother was able to do where he basically asked a certain question, and Robin came to his own understanding and said, "Oh, my mother's died, hasn't she?" "Yes, but you can't kill yourself, can you?" Robin is based on several historical figures. The earliest stories of him are divination stories, so he was a semi-prophet. You can tell that that's really connected in with the Welsh literary culture, the bardic culture, right? And then a lot of his other stories just became piled on. Robin cheating the devil, Robin. A lot of the stories that you see in other magicians started piling onto him. These figures become containers, and they become containers for stories that are really good. And so, in Cardiff there, the St. Fagan's archive have tons of stories from 1950s being told about Robin from these old 80-year-old gentlemen who heard them when they were young in the 1870s, right? So these stories just go back further in time, but they're so ridiculous and fun. They're just great.
With his brothers trying to sort of con him out of things.
Yeah, so one of the stories preserved is his two brothers became very jealous of him, and he was able to outsmart each of them and basically take their flock. So they didn't want him to have anything, and somehow he came into a flock of sheep, and so they wanted it. And how the story goes is he somehow managed to trick them to say that he got his sheep from the underworld, Anmoon, and showed them, went to the seaside and showed them, oh, it's down there. And so what did the brothers do? They jumped into the water and drowned because they were looking for sheep, right? So it's a little ridiculous, but it's fun. Again, you get that sense of humor, right? You get that real sense of humor. People being out in the fields, people telling these stories, Nine or Tide telling these stories to their grandchildren. And you just get that sense of this is the culture of the time that's continued, right?
And then hags don't get a great picture in the book, do they? They've got the hags of the mist and child-devouring hags.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and I tried to make it, again, a lot of this is geared towards North Americans, people who are outside of Wales, but I came to realise how little of the folklore people in Wales, at least of certain generations, really know because of the dare I say oppression of the English culture, right? A lot of these stories were not told starting in the 1950s onwards. So you get this understanding that gwarach, right, in Welsh, hag, is also meaning witch, and the two are very different. So the stories, when you actually look at the stories, you've got hag like Maltinos, for example, right, Matilda the Night, Canrig Butte, right? Anything cannibalistic, anything other than human, which would be the English idea of what a witch is not the same as the witches here. But like some of the stories like Maltinos and the Gwrachi Ribbon, right? And I apologise if any Welsh speakers in the audience. It's been 30 years, I apologise. Dwi ddim siarad Cymraeg, dwi'n dysgu Cymraeg. Right? You get this sense of otherworldliness, of monstrousness, and part of that is that English kind of folklorists who are writing, and they're like, oh, this must be a hag, therefore it's going to be a witch. Very different, right?
But there are witches as well, witches of Landonna.
Yes, yes. So probably the most famous clan of witches known outside of Wales and inside of Wales. And depending upon the source, we only have a few sources for this story actually, but they've just become this massive thing. And it's a clan of witches that appeared one day just outside on the north shore, just north of Beaumaris, and terrorized all of the local people. And what happened is they became a container then for historical Finian Husbis, who became kind of connected. Belafawr from Denbigh became one of their leaders, even though Denbigh is nowhere near Beaumaris, right? But again, like you can see the travel lines, you can see how people are then connecting because they're telling the story as they go through, right? So it's quite monstrous. And so what started as a historical woman just trying to make money and coin by doing fortunes in a marketplace in Denbigh in the 1800s. 100 years later, she's suddenly eating children and devouring, livestock and all this horrible stuff. But they make great stories too, so,
And what was the influence of the Mabinogi on your book?
This was a surprise. So for, just by a show of hands, has anybody spent a lot of time outside of Wales in North America? No? Okay, so a couple, yeah. So North America, of course, and I think this really speaks to the lack of not interest, but the lack of resources of authentic Welsh folklore, is of course a Mabinogi, right? Everybody's read in a Mabinogi in North America, at least those who are interested in anything Celtic, right? And when you actually look at the stories, there's very few actual connection pieces, right? You of course have the stories of Ceridwen, right? And you have the stories of, Bendigeid Fran and all of all the characters from there. But when you actually look at then the folklore, there's a distinction, and there's a reason for this. Is because the stories of the Mabinogi were only preserved in so many manuscripts. They were not necessarily well known in the community versus these stories which were. If Charlotte Guest hadn't put out her book 150 years ago, right, a lot of these stories wouldn't be well known in Wales. That's just the reality of it, right? They were known within the bardic tradition, the Eisteddfod tradition, but they weren't necessarily known generally, and especially amongst the English-speaking Welsh population, because there was no connection there, right? So I think that's what we see with that is the repercussion of the loss of the Welsh language and loss of the Eisteddfod community in Wales generally, and the retreat of that. But that being said, it became popular in North America and outside of Wales because of nationalists, right? So you have nationalists who were really bringing these stories out and promoting them as an authentic Welsh identity to outsiders. So the people telling these stories, they're not interested if Cerridwen is, connected to Llyn Tegid. They're really more interested in not having their children devoured by Cenrig Butte up the road, right? Yeah.
Excellent. And there's a fair bit in the book on South East Wales with Monmouthshire and Gwent. One bit was the apparition of spirits, spectres that haunt lonely and out-of-the-way places, such as the Monmouthshire countryside.
Yeah, so Monmouthshire, and my great-grand comes from Monmouthshire, so I feel almost like I've come home in some ways. It's a dynamic place because the borders and Monmouthshire were really that cultural zone where you get the English and the Welsh, right? I was sat down near the river before, and two people were wandering by, and we happened to strike up a conversation, and they said, do you know what's over there? I said, well, that's England over there. We all laughed, right? But it really is that cultural zone, so you get you get a real dynamic set of stories that are obviously English, obviously Welsh, but then obviously in the middle too. One of my favourite stories is, I'm trying to think where it is. Of course I can't because it all blanks now, but you'll get a sense when you start to read through the book, and it's pocket size, you can pick up the stories bit by bit, but you'll really get a sense of Monmouthshire having very different identity than, say, Pembroke or Gwynedd or Isle of Anglesey or wherever, right? And I think that's what tells us that its folklore is organic, because you've got the mix and wonderful stories. Yeah.
And there's a magic book of Abergavenny.
Yes. So this is where you start bringing in the ideas of Shakespeare, but also the historical. Traditionally, Dynhuspis and a lot of vicars were understood to have magic powers. And one of the reasons for that is because they were connected to the Bible, right? So this is true of England as well, but Wales particularly. The Bible was used as a source of magic and charms and psalms, and singing of the psalms, for example, to curse or to heal, right? So you get these stories, and particularly the Magic Book of Abergavenny, where it's not explicitly stated to be the Bible, but just because of looking around that it has to be, where the book is become really important. And I believe with that one, I apologize, I believe with that one, the idea is you've got this magic book that an apprentice suddenly reads and a spirit jumps out, right? This we know then is connected to Shakespeare, and because Shakespeare had such a massive role in bringing Welsh stuff into England and then English stuff into Wales, this goes back to the Dr. Faustus. So Dr. Faustus is the prototype for the philosopher who sells his soul to the devil and then gains power but ruins his life because of it. And this is where the idea of magic books, grimoires, come in. And grimoires traditionally were actually passed down in the monastic sphere. So and I don't want to be patronizing here, but to an illiterate audience, when they saw a book of, say, mathematics that was written in a strange language they couldn't know, they saw all the beautiful images and the it would be easy to look at that and be, that must be a magic book, right? And so because of that, then there's a connection to then vicars and in Catholic times monks, right? And then that generates that tradition. So you have these wild stories of these books that are able to, are filled with spirits, and you have to be careful, so you lock them up, you don't open them up, because the spirit will come out, you'll have to command it.
There's one where there's two spirits that have to fight with each other to stop them.
Exactly, yes. And that is, that's historically true. This is a worldwide phenomenon. You see this particularly in like Catholic Europe. You've got these ideas of these grimoires. There's the Devil's Bible, for example. There's a big picture of a devil in it, and had the reputation that it was evil, or that a devil was actually inside it. But then you also have this idea of it being used for magical purposes.
Cool. And then we do go beyond the borders of Wales, because it's the borders as well as Wales. So you've got Gloucestershire and Herefordshire and north of there.
Yes.
What sort of thing went on there, and how is that different?
So I think growing up partly right on the border, Cerwis is part of the borders. You get this real sense that you just go over across the river and suddenly you're in England. And historically, that's not true. A lot of those areas were originally either properly part of Wales, or they would have been part of the Welsh cultural zone. And even now, there's a lot of Welsh speakers just over the border in Shropshire and Herefordshire, right? So if we look at it from that border point of view, you've got a mixture then of those English elements, those stories that are really, you can say, oh yeah, they fit in with English cunning folklore and witch lore. And then you've got those other stories where it's obviously Welsh, right? You also have characters that may have come from, say, I don't know, Wrexham or Rewabon, for example, and they're travelling down to Oswestry, or they're travelling on to Shrewsbury or places like that. So the story embraces those places. And I think that we have to understand that it's part of that dynamic. The border isn't just a big wall, it's permeable. People are moving back and forth. So we have stories of like the Dun Cow. The Dun Cow is a really notable story from Warwickshire. It's the idea that this magical cow appears and is able to feed everybody because its udder never stops producing milk. A witch comes, and out of pure jealousy or spite, she just milks and milks and milks into the sieve that all the milk is wasted. There are at least 5 iterations of that one story. 2 in Wales, 1 in Shropshire, 1 up north and 1 down south. And they're all connected because traders, people traveling around. And in every place, there was supposed to have been a rib bone of this cow preserved. And you could actually go and see this, right? I don't think it was the same rib bone, and most of the time it was probably a whale bone, but that's beside the point, right?
There are a lot of bones to be seen back in there.
It's all bones, yes, exactly, yes.
And then any other sort of favourite tales you've got you wanted to...
Oh.
Sorry, I put you on the spot now.
Yeah, it's funny, I get asked that all the time, and they're all my favourites, but there is one, let's see, there is one down in South Wales, over in Swansea, and just north of Swansea, and this woman who was described as having a very deep voice and a very large nose, and would always have her shawl over her and would not appear in daylight. She lived in a house that had the blinders on all the time. People would go to her and get their fortunes told, get curses, get potions, like literally like the village witch idea, right? And she ended up, at least in the story, she ended up burning down the house in order to get insurance money, and then her and the 2 roommates moved into a bigger house. So it's quite fun. There's a lot of fun stories. A lot of the Robin tales are great. Yeah, they were really fun. And I to be honest, because I didn't grow up in a Welsh-speaking family, I did not know most of those. And so that was a really cool thing to find a character that was so vibrant and had so many stories connected to him that I only heard a little tiny bit about. So that was fun.
Yeah, I was going to ask what sort of surprises, what did you learn while writing the book?
It was weird because I was writing this after being 30 years away, and it was like literally like snowing outside. I was in the wilds of Canada, and thinking about Wales and thinking about all of these places. And what surprised me was actually how many of these I had heard before. but when I was a little kid, right? And then connecting in with friends, fellow writers from over here. How many of them we actually have? Because when I did England, a lot of areas in England did not have the folklorists who were writing these stories down. Lincolnshire was practically nothing, right? You really get a sense of the writers of these and the preservers of these stories really trying to fight against a very particular cultural oppression. My parents are from the north. They're up from Lancashire and Yorkshire, and they're mutts. They have family all over the place, Wales being one of them. And Yorkshire particularly, you get such a vibrant collection of the stories because, again, very similar to the writers here, they were wanting to preserve the stories before they disappeared. So if we didn't have these writers and these folklorists and these antiquarians and these travel writers who were so engaged with and beloved of Welsh culture, we wouldn't have this. And then where would we be, right? You really get a sense from these writers that they loved the places that they were visiting, loved their communities, loved their culture, and it just feels cozy, like going around with Reverend Owen Davies, or Reverend Owen, I should say, and he's just sitting having tea with a regular colleague, and they're talking about monstrous, cannibal witches, and it's just like, oh, my people, So that was really cool. That the community feeling of it.
And then what's the sort of folklore traditions of Canada?
Well, and so Canada's a weird one because it's so massive. So the part of Ontario that I come from is actually the exact same size as the whole of Wales. But because our roads are all long and straight and some days it takes 40 minutes to get to the grocery store, right? It's very mixed. So because of the colonialism and because of where people were settling, you get parts where, obviously, this is where the Welsh were, these were where the Polish people were, these were where the Scandinavians were. And then you get those areas where a lot of mixture happens. So we have stories of like Bigfoot. We have stories of, in the area I was living, it was part German originally, and then along the coast was Scottish and Irish. So you get a lot of the Scottish and Irish stories, but they're landed in the landscape, right? Very similar. What we have more of is more urban legends that are more connected to place. But the original older stories, there's reminiscences to that. So, one of the lakes that I used to live on, Lake Simcoe, has Kempenfelt Kelly, a lake monster, very similar to Loch Ness, except it's a giant, allegedly a giant alligator. How a giant alligator is surviving in the winter in Canada, I have no idea, but it is, right? So it's dynamic, depending on where you are. The thing with North America is it's massive, but we travel a lot more. So whereas over here, you say, oh, have you ever gone to, I don't know, if somebody's living in Caerphilly, oh, have you ever gone to, Llangollen? No, I've never been to Llangollen before. It's like 2 hours away. Like, what are you doing, right? Whereas as us, we have to go far distance, so. Yeah,
I remember being there, and it's just 4 hours to go to a concert, and completely normal.
Yeah, but it's weird too, because, when you live close to a place, we don't necessarily go to it. So where I used to live, it was 2 hours from Niagara Falls. I think in 30 years, I've only been to Niagara Falls twice. And yet everybody goes to those tourist places, Yeah, so there's a psychology to it.
Great. Has anyone got any questions they want to ask Ben? No pressure. I've got a few more. I wanted to ask about the evil eye.
Mm-hmm. So the evil eye, this is a pan-European thing. You see this a lot in particularly the further east you go, you tend to find a lot of it. But there was this general belief in the culture, same in England too, that if you looked at somebody with an evil eye, it wasn't so much that they necessarily were directing. It could be that they just had a really nasty persona. And so they just were able to bewitch you by the evil eye. Sometimes really good people had this. And there's stories in here of really good people having this evil eye that then they had to be careful of. And so then they were ostracized from the communities, and becomes really sad in many ways, very emotional. And then you also have others who they were understood to have evil eye. So when, I hope nobody's named Neris here. I just have this image of little Neris running around. So if there is a Neris in the audience, I'm not bothering you, please. But like little Neris, you would give her a sack of flour because, you don't want her to bewitch her, right? Or you don't want her to bewitch you. And so it becomes that kind of reputation thing. Yeah.
I've also got summoning spells in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this really comes from that whole grimoire tradition, the occult tradition, and it's the summoning of spirits, the summoning of fairies as well. I was talking in London a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how traditional Welsh magic, you have a lot of like summoning the fairies to ask them to work on your behalf, and it's very particular. This is why maybe this is a connection to the Mabinogi, but the whole idea here is you're supposed to cast yourself a circle, place a linen on a table or on the ground, and you're giving the fairies, you're offering the fairies very particularly roast chicken and a bowl of cream and fresh baked bread. But that roast chicken is really important because apparently, Tel of Teague really love roast chicken. In other stories or versions of this, you also have a roast black hen or black cock. And this is connected in with Mabinogi because you have like black hens appearing in that quite often. So that might be a connection. That might also just be black being, the colour of the devil, colour of evil, colour of the infernal. So it can be presented to the fairies or to the devil or whatnot. Yeah.
When do you think is the most recent folk tale? Or when does it stop becoming folk tales and then legends?
It's a really good question. So yes, so Llangorrig, up just on east of Aberystwyth there, there's a story from the 1940s and 50s, and a figure in there called Old Griff. And Old Griff was understood to be one of these dynhuspis, these knowing ones, right? But the writer was a spiritualist. She was a bit of a New Age spiritualist back in the 1950s and 40s, and he was supposed to have had a miracle stone, and this stone was given to him, and this is where we start to see then that kind of New Age spiritualism coming in. This miracle stone was able to heal, and she wrote a huge big long book about this old man, and he may have been connected with some of the older stories from like 100 years earlier of maybe his grandparents, grandfathers. But we don't really hear much about him particularly. We hear more about her and her whole journey and her like using this miracle stone. And it ended up I believe it ended up somewhere in Australia or somewhere like that. But that appears in one of our more recent T. Gwyn Jones 1973 folklore book, and I would say that's the most recent one. I can't think of any more, because the issue with folklore again is a lot of these stories stopped being told. That's why they needed to be preserved. But because they were preserved in such a way, when people learn about the folklore, they go into folklore books, right? Stories are being told and shared in the community still, but they're changed. They're no longer, it's not that vibrant tradition. A lot of times people would have read and then just told that version, right, in a garbled form. So we do have folklore now, but I would say that the folklore is more the urban legends that are coming up, right? So like the big cat of Abergavenny, for example, right, which really is just a big tomcat, right? But no, it's an escaped lion, of course. Yeah, that kind of thing, that kind of process is always going on. It's more difficult for us to see it because we're in modern 21st century, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's being communicated in a different way to how it was.
And it's being exactly, yeah.
Great. Well, that's been a really interesting evening, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks
This is
everyone
fabulous.
for coming. We've got copies of the book on sale, and Ben will happily sign and dedicate them for you. But give them a big round of applause for coming tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you.